Alright, so when equal pay comes up in conversation, most of us tiptoe around the subject. Whether we agree or disagree with the idea, it's hard to prove our point without the certain facts to back it up. Especially in the sports industry, talks of equal pay aren't being brought up enough. Female athletes are paid considerably less than male athletes, and although their style or the game might differ, that doesn't exactly provide the evidence that is needed to prove against equal pay. All throughout high school, I played sports, and growing up, I loved watching them. That's how I became a fan of the U.S. national women's soccer team. Those of you who don't know, the U.S. women's soccer team won the World Cup this past summer, and while doing so, they actually also had an ongoing lawsuit against the U.S. Soccer Federation. And although most of you probably don't really care much in particular about this lawsuit, it's important to be able to understand all of the facts and the statistics for women athletes' pay gap before we argue for or against it. Today I invite you to listen with an open mind as I discuss the need for women athletes to be paid equal to their male counterparts. I'll start off first by illustrating the gap between the men and women pay. The statistics following men and women pay provide a small window into the pay disparity between the two. For example, the top WNBA salary this past season was $117,000, well, compared to the $37.4 million of the NBA. In a New York Times article by Maya Salam, she reported that the top WNBA draft earned only around $53,000, while the NBA top draft earned around $6 million. Tennis is one of the most equal pay in sports right now, and it still has unequal pay in most of the tourneys, or in most of the tournaments, as you can see from this study that was published in the journal. One of the ones that's the most equal is the US Open, but most of the other ones still have unequal pay between male and female athletes. Due to the decrease in the income during regular seasons, female athletes are having to play overseas while during the off season. On an average, the WNBA players earn around $71,000 annually, while men earn $6 million per year. To compensate for that lower pay that the WNBA receives, many players end up going over to Europe or South America to play in leagues on the off season, just in order to have livable wages off of basketball alone. So many people relate this pay disparity to the differences in athleticism or in the revenue gained. Most of the female athletes have around the same amount of compatibility as male athletes, according to O'Shaughnessy from the New York Times. In both men and women tennis matches per year, the number of baseline points won, the net points won, and the serve and volley points won are basically equal for both gender. Additionally, Serena Williams, one of the most famous female tennis players, had a 126 mile per hour serve in 2015, which was faster than Novak Djokovic, which is one of the most popular men's tennis players, and he also won the men's tournament that year. One of the main reasons for the pay gap in tennis comes down to smaller crowds generating less revenue and playing shorter matches. But then there comes the point that when women games do generate the same revenue as the men, they still don't receive the same money. Going back to the U.S. women's soccer team, they earned more revenue over the past 3 years than the men's team did, while also winning more games. They have 4 Olympic gold medals and 4 World Cup titles, and the men do not. And they're still earning less money in prize money and just in wages than the men are winning. So yes, women games bring in less revenue most of the time, but they also have less investment into the sport, and they don't have the same outreach as men. So women athletes aren't fighting for complete equal pay right now. They understand that the men and women's games are different, but until they're on the same playing field as the men, the paying less of women can't be justified. Many women's games aren't played on the same TV platform and regularly aren't made available to the public very easily unless it's like a very monumental game. One example of this recently actually was this, not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before, was the National Women's Soccer League finals. And it was also on the Sports Equinox, which is where football, basketball, hockey, and baseball are all played on the same day. And everybody was talking about that, but they weren't talking about the women's soccer final, which just means that it's not being played on the same TV networks and it's not getting the same outreach that the men's teams are getting. Forbes reported that the more TV exposure for players will lead to more visibility, and therefore more visibility could lead to more endorsers in the future, which brings the fact to the endorsers of female athletes. A study done by female athletes make up 40% of athletes as a whole, but they're only a part of 4% of the news coverage right now. And a study done by Carrie Baker showed that during a 12-day period, there were a total of 92 stories done in the USA Today, and only 10 of those stories were done on women's sports. And you might ask like what the time period was on this, because if a sport's not being played, then the relevance and how much it's being talked about probably won't be that much. But it was during March Madness, where both women and men teams are playing at the same time, and the women still didn't get as much news coverage as the men did. So female athletes don't receive the equal brand coverage that men do. Nike has not done a signature shoe for a woman in the past 20 years, while you see men players wearing Jordans or LeBrons all the time. And that's a lack of foundation for the players to build from and to like capitalize on their talent. One of the endorsers of the U.S. women's team actually is Budweiser, and they're the only sponsor of the team. They're trying to generate more. But if you bring in more endorsers and you bring in more money into the sport, they're going to be able to use that money to invest into other things and bring in the revenue and the crowd that you want to get. So they need to be put on the same level as men before we start talking about equal pay. In summary, women athletes deserve the same amount of investment as male athletes and their counterparts, and they have the athletic ability to prove it, as we've seen in the U.S. women's soccer team. Hopefully I've given enough information to begin the conversation of equal pay in women's sports, or at least the equal investment of women's sports.